Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, March 19th, and some big news stories. I'm not sure which one you think is the bigger story. I mean, obviously, we had the call between Trump and Putin. It seemed to be a very productive call. But then also in the Middle East, we have some major escalations with Israel going back into Gaza, bombing Gaza, the very inflammatory rhetoric from Trump with regards to Iran, and it looks like we have a kind of a little mini war now with Yemen. So which one of these is the bigger news story? What should we be paying attention to more, and why?
Well, I think actually the Middle East story is the bigger story, right now anyway. That it's substantively much more is going on. Um, this telephone conversation and some of the events surrounding it are, potentially very important and even of greater importance than what's happening in the Middle East. But, we have to admit at this stage that not much happened. Most of what's happening is symbolic, let's say, and rhetorical, which could indicate substantive changes down the road. But we're not there. But we can start with either one of them. Maybe I'll just start with what's happening between Russia and not Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and the U.S. Yeah, of course, a phone conversation was held between President Putin and President Trump. It lasted over 2 hours. And at the end of it, a very partial ceasefire was declared. It was Putin agreed to a ceasefire on that would cover attacks on each side's energy facilities, airstrikes on each side's energy facilities. And apparently he implemented it immediately. He ordered the Gerasimov, the commander, the head uh, of the Russian military, to cease all attacks on energy facilities. And according to the Ministry of Defense, there were actually drones in the air that were going, on course to strike an energy facility within Ukraine, and the Russians shot down their own drones in order to comply with this ceasefire request from the president. Now, again, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians, several hours after this ceasefire proposal, because I guess the Ukrainians hadn't agreed to it. We have to say it's a proposal in their case, sent a number of drones. Um, let's see how many, I don't know actually the number, but they struck an oil transshipment facility in the Krasnodar region. Now, this this was connected to a pipeline that feeds into the Caspian Consortium. I guess it's called the Caspian Petroleum Consortium, which is actually a multinational consortium. Russia's part of it, but the U.S. is too, and which is kind of an indirect attack on the U.S. Earlier, they had directly attacked a pipeline that was where the U.S. clearly had a certain amount of ownership, or a U.S. company did. And that raised some eyebrows. Now they've done this. So it seems it's certainly not a friendly gesture, let's say. Let's put it that way on the part of the Ukrainians. So, but anyway, going back to the conversation, we had, there was this one agreement, which was something, touted by Trump afterwards, the agreement on the energy facility airstrikes. But then also there was a promise on the part of Putin, to maintain free passage of commercial vessels in the Black Sea. Now, my understanding is that that's actually been going on, so it doesn't really change anything. It maybe just formalizes what was implicit, previously. And then as far as the energy airstrikes, it is, you could describe it as a concession, or at least as a gesture, which was not totally meaningless on the part of the Russians, but it was a very minor gesture because, though, again, if we believe the Russian Ministry of Defense, they did actually cancel an operation. More than that, they shot down their own drones. Um, Often the Russians will go for maybe a month without striking their energy facilities in Ukraine. So, maybe they had this one strike planned, or actually had started, but it was a fairly minor one, and maybe they didn't have another one for another month. So it was something, a very, very minor concession, more of a gesture. But, again, gestures are important on the part of Russia. But he didn't, on all the major issues that where the Russians have repeated again and again, the matters that really concern them, such as, actually weapons supplies to Ukraine, the things that Trump, not Trump, but rather Putin brought up in his statement following that ceasefire announcement, the original ceasefire announcement several days ago. He pointed to the need to stop weapons supplies to Ukraine, actually to stop training and have a very, he asked the question rhetorically, how are we going to monitor this? Clearly they have to have some sort of monitoring regime that has to be worked out in detail. All those things, he didn't budge on any of those. And of course, the larger questions of neutrality and so on, there's no sign that he budged. Interestingly, it seems like Trump anyway seemed to, kind of accept the Russian position on actually on weapon supplies. He at least suggested. Now, of course, they have weapon supplies to Ukraine from the U.S. have resumed, but he seemed to imply that maybe that was something they can reconsider. So anyway, you can say there wasn't anything really very significant that came out of it in substantive terms, but it was. That there were gestures involved, which they may be mainly symbolic, but that can be important. That's the first step. Maybe that's where you begin. Again, I think it needs to be emphasized that real negotiations have not begun. A couple of telephone conversations do not equal negotiations. You do actually have to put together teams and start working out the details. This is everything, the ceasefire, pretty much all of it has been kind of taken place on the level of rhetoric, and we have to start, we have to get down to the nitty gritty, and you do that actually with negotiation teams, and apparently both the Russians and the Americans are putting together those teams, and then we'll see what happens. If there's going to be real progress, it'll be made through real negotiations with teams sitting down together at the table and just hashing out all the details.
It's strange because where's Ukraine in all this? It seems like Ukraine is kind of sidelined. It's like,
clearly.
So, but what does that mean? It's like we agreed to a ceasefire, but technically we're not involved, supposed to be part of this conflict. But obviously, what we're doing is just stating that this is our conflict, this is our proxy. But if we are getting better relations with Russia and Trump seems to be enjoy working with Putin more than Zelensky. It seems like our relationship with Russia is getting better and better, where our relationship with the Ukraine-Kiev regime is plummeting, but they're our proxy. So what does that mean? Well, could we lose control of our proxy? Could we, will they abide to, we agreed to the ceasefire with Russia, but you said, Putin said immediately, okay, we'll stop the energy infrastructure. Ukraine's not going to abide by it, right? They don't.
Yeah, well, they actually launched an attack last night, right?
Right, on a joint consortium, you said, between that included the U.S. as well as Russia and other countries. So, where do you see this going? Where does Ukraine play out in all this? Do you think that they will just go completely rogue? I mean, obviously, they probably have to be furious with the United States, right?
Yeah. Well, the Ukrainians have been defiant. Zelensky in particular. There was some hope. I think a number of people thought that after that meeting in Jeddah, between the Ukrainians and the Americans, after which this ceasefire announcement was made, that because in that, the readout after that meeting, there wasn't any mention of the usual Ukrainian requirements. And there was actually one statement in there where, this is a sort of an aside, but it really is kind of funny. He said that the Ukrainians said that it was, in the readout, it said that the Ukrainians, regard European involvement very important to the process. but it just was the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Americans didn't think so. But there wasn't any mention of all those other, matters, the NATO membership and all those things that territorial integrity, the kind of things that Ukraine has always been emphasizing is absolutely necessary. And so there was some hope that maybe they had quietly agreed to concede on those grounds. But it's clear since then, and especially now that they haven't. Zelensky has made all those demands. He's repeated them again and again, since that meeting. And I believe he did it again today. The Ukrainians are adamant. They're not budging. And they clearly do not want to cooperate with with the terms of any agreement. I think that could be reached between the U.S. and Russia. So really the only thing that the Americans can do, and it's real, is cut off the flow of arms. Now they did that, but it was just for a couple of days earlier, right? Maybe a few days, but they have to be serious about it. I mean, I don't know why they resumed it, after just this verbal assurance on a ceasefire. It seems like that was a mistake on the part of the Americans, in my opinion. But if they really want Ukraine to agree to this, the only way they can make them do that is by really turning the screws on them. And of course, the Americans can do that. They have enormous leverage over the Ukrainians. But it's still not clear that the Ukrainians would actually cave in on these. Again, Russia is, not Russia, but rather Europe has been constantly repeating and very loudly, that we can take over, this now is our fight. Don't worry, Ukraine, we have your back. And the Ukrainians have, to some extent, echoed that. Now, I think, we've discussed this earlier, that's all fantasy. But these people live in a fantasy world, and maybe that's what they really do. So even if the U.S. applies leverage, I don't know that you're going to get Ukraine to make any significant concessions. I think the wiser thing, if the Americans just want to get out of this war, and I think Trump actually really does, and some other people, important people around him, really do. The thing is there, it's going to have to be a unilateral decision on the part of the U.S. It's just like, if you can't get the Ukrainians to go along, well, you just leave and say, okay, Europeans, you guys, you're so eager, you believe you can do this, you do it. It's your affair. Anyway, this war is happening in Europe. It's not happening over here. It's your problem. And maybe that's what will happen. I think that's the only thing that we can really hope for. Again and again, I've said, I don't think that a real deal, though that would be best. It would be best for Russia, for everybody concerned, if a real deal was negotiated, that actually establish a new security architecture for Europe. That's what the Russians were looking for. That would be the best for everybody concerned. But I'm afraid that just can't happen. And part of the problem, of course, is the biggest part of the problem is probably Ukraine. So the next best thing is for the U.S. to walk away from this. And that will bring the war to a faster end. It could actually, rather than being a couple more years, who knows, it could be just a matter of months. I don't think that the Ukrainians really could hold out very long without the Americans.
Do the EU, do the European countries have any cards to play? There's talk of them sending troops. It keeps on being floated around and it keeps on getting shot down. But then I heard something about, 10,000 British troops going to be sent over to Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if is there anything substantive there? Or is this just all bluster?
Well, I think it's basically bluster, because they keep on talking about that, or even implying that maybe they'll just send in the troops even absent a ceasefire. Usually it's predicated on a ceasefire. We get a ceasefire, then our troops are going to go in. But this is actually a way of, I don't know if it's intentional or not, if it's just an intentional effort to sabotage negotiations, or it's just stupidity. It's hard to say with the Europeans. But this promise this constantly repeated promise that we are going to send in troops as soon as there's a ceasefire provides the Russians with a huge disincentive, right? They say, well, if that's what's going to happen the moment we have a ceasefire, we're not doing this, because then we can't accept that, and we'll strike them. The whole thing will escalate. Things will get much worse. But I don't know how real these promises are. Because usually there's a condition attached to this promise to send European troops into Ukraine, and that is that, of course, if they, this is to provide a security guarantee to the Ukrainians, but we need our own security guarantee from the Americans. So the Americans have to back us up because it's an admission of their own weakness. And the Americans again and again have said, no, we're not doing that. And I really don't think that they're going to get that from the Trump administration. So it's hot air, but it's very dangerous hot air, and it's hot air that is making negotiations less and less real, substantive, ultimately successful negotiations less and less likely.
So it's kind of what you're predicting is that relations between the United States and Russia will improve, and we will agree on different bilateral agreements and, maybe some type of reset, warming of relations. But we won't be able to necessarily control Ukraine. We may, if Ukraine doesn't abide by the ceasefire or want to engage in some type of negotiated settlement, then we will probably just walk away. We'll say, okay, no more arms. Maybe we cut off Starlink, no more aid at all. And then this is going to put huge pressure on the European countries to step up, because they've been voicing all this, the sentiment said, don't worry, we got your back, Ukraine, we got your back. Now Zelensky's like, okay, well, here's your time to step up, because the Americans have left, and we'll see if they step up. And most likely you think they won't. They'll end up being back down, and that'll be the end of their political careers probably as well, because they've just put all this talk into it. And then when it actually comes to say, can you walk the walk? They're likely not going to walk the walk, or maybe they will. Maybe they will try, and then that will also definitely be the end of their political career at that stage.
Yeah. They really can't. They just don't have the means. They lack they don't have the weapons. They don't have the military industries. This is really just talk. Now there's some idea. There's this proposal made by von der Leyen that they're going to make $800 billion or more, or not dollars, but rather euros of credit available to support defense industries throughout Europe. Again, it's credit, it's loans, and these are countries that are not in very good fiscal shape. So again, none of this looks realistic. It just seems to be talk, and I don't think you. And there really is an absence of support, and there are real differences within Europe too. We have the Brits are always eager to do anything, to take any kind of hostile action against Russia. And so are the Baltics, the Baltic states. But if you see real divisions, the Italians are very reluctant to go. And, so far the Germans have said that they don't want to, but now we're getting the new chancellor, and we'll see. He's made decisions within Germany to actually take off the debt brake that Germany had. Germany was a very, fiscally conservative country. And that's something that grew out of the Weimar experience, the hyperinflation. He said, never again. We've got to be very, very careful. We can't have, accumulate these huge debts. But so that's been sort of a real taboo, or you could say, or a red line within Germany. It's okay, we have to keep our debt under control. Now it's already expanded significantly, but it's still much less than other developed countries and other countries in Europe. But he wants to take the brakes off specifically for military industry and infrastructure. Again, they're talking about indebtedness. That's the way they're going to go about it. I don't see that they have the means to do it. Certainly in the short or medium term, potentially theoretically in the long run they could do it. But I have my doubts about that in any case. And in the long run, the war will be over. So what can they do?
Right. Well, if they want to go down that route, the first thing they need to do is to get cheap energy again, right? You're just going to start making tanks at 4 times the price because you don't have the energy to do it. So there's talks about the U.S. and Russia repairing the Nord Stream pipeline. Do you think if they do that, will Germany say like, okay, give us some of that cheap gas again? Or they, I mean, have they put themselves in a corner like, no, we're on this moral hill,
Yeah,
and
yeah, we can't have cheap gas. We're only in favor of expensive gas.
right, and to continue to deindustrialize. It's astonishing. This suicide that they're committing here in throughout Europe. So what is that happening? Do you know anything about that Nord Stream pipeline repair? Is that part?
Well, it's not happening, but there's been some talk about it. That's all. It's just talk, and nothing official. I think it's all kind of, it's maybe more than rumor, but not a whole lot more than that. Yeah, well, one thing is like, yeah, there are encouraging signs, clearly, between the Russian and U.S. leadership. So clearly relations are improving. And we have pulled back from the precipice. Biden took us right up there to the edge with his continual escalations, his continued, unrelenting hostility. And that has ended, and that's very encouraging, but still there are, I think earlier I said there were 24,311 sanctions. I saw another figure just the other day of 29,000 sanctions on Russia. And
nice.
Yeah, so it's the most sanctioned country in the world. And in fact, that number has not decreased under Trump. In fact, it has increased. He let some things go forward. So we really have not. It's what we've seen so far is symbolic, which doesn't mean that I don't say that doesn't, because it's symbolic, it's just meaningless. I think it is quite meaningful, but nothing substantive. And I do have my concerns about. Whether or not we will reach, make these substantive gains. I think I mentioned earlier that that those negotiations that were held between the U.S. team and the Russian team over the question of embassy restaffing really didn't make any significant progress. And the Russians complained that it was the same old faces. In other words, they were looking at the Biden Blinken team across the table. And these people had instructions from above, okay, you're supposed to do this, but they can drag their feet. That's a lot of what the deep state is about. You can have a new, there's a new guy in charge at the top. He issues the commands, but they don't necessarily get implemented. Or, by the time the command travels through all these offices, it's unrecognizable. Or, it's just not the same thing. That it doesn't reflect the intentions of the leadership. So, that's the thing. It's like, who are the people that are going to make up these teams? And are they really committed to making significant progress? We'll see. That's something that's not, it's not exciting like a telephone call, but that's where the real progress is made. And so I still have my concerns about this, that potentially, I don't think we won't have a negotiated settlement to the war. I'm afraid that that's not going to happen. But potentially there are all kinds of other things we can do. I mean, there are other areas of where the U.S. and Russia can cooperate, in economic spheres and other spheres as well. But still, we could at least restaff the embassies and get ambassadors appointed and all that kind of thing. That's supposed to happen, but it still hasn't happened. And maybe it will, but we still haven't seen the real progress. And so I do have my doubts. I don't doubt, again, the intentions of Trump, but I do have my concerns about his ability to actually translate his intentions into real changes, in the real world.
Okay, so you're telling us to temper expectations.
Yeah,
cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I say cautiously. Yeah.
Well, it's hard not to feel optimistic because you hear statements. I believe Peskov made some comment just like the world is a much safer place now after that phone call, something like that. And I believe Witkoff called the phone call. I believe he said epic and transformative,
right?
Something like this. So it's like using words like that, I'm like, whoa, epic. That's a good one,
Yeah,
right?
I know. I noticed that too. I think that's excessive, and to be honest, the Russians are much more cautious and I think more realistic about this. Again, Witkoff is maybe he really is a good negotiator, a good emissary for Trump, but he has virtually no, prior to this administration, prior to his appointment, he had zero experience in diplomacy. And, one thing that maybe we can use this as a segue, he had his initial success in the Middle East in brokering the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but that has fallen apart. And I, you can't put the blame entirely on him, but the fact is that, after brokering that ceasefire, which actually described this two-phase process, he agreed to the change of terms. It was just essentially he started reflecting the Israeli position. And the Israelis didn't, because Netanyahu clearly never wanted to do that second phase. So he began to just say, to approach Hamas and say, well, let's just get an extension of the first phase, let's forget the second phase for now. And that was, you have to, trust is so important, let's say, in diplomacy. It is, trust has to be built up over time. And when you make promises, you really have to keep them. And he broke his promise in essence right there. And I think that's part of the reason that we're in such a fix right now in Palestine and in the greater Middle East.
Yeah, I was listening to Gilbert Doctorow this morning on judging freedom, and he had an interesting theory that I'll throw out to you. He was saying that he has this theory that Trump is trying to perform this sort of grand reset, sort of establish a new world order, with Russia, potentially with China, Brazil, India. But in order to do that, he needs to maintain a certain amount of political capital in the United States, which means appeasing the Zionists. So that's why he says he's tackling one thing at a time now, focusing on the bigger thing. And then what he's doing is morally abject, but he's saying that this is what he has to do in order to create the whole new world order of a multipolar world. Do you believe in that at all? Or is that just, just some giving cover to Trump for what he's doing in the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, we've discussed this earlier. It's hard to tell exactly what Trump thinks. But his record is vis-a-vis Israel and Zionism is that he is an ultra-Zionist. I mean, in his first term, he gave the Israelis things that previous U.S. administrations never gave them, like the annexation of the Golan Heights and the relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Those were hugely significant and were huge concessions to the Zionists. And again, we've also talked about the fact that he is, so if you look at his history, he has behaved like an ultra-Zionist, and sometimes there are a few comments that he's made. There was that Jeffrey Sachs video or whatever that makes you wonder. But with Trump, it's really hard to say. I mean, the guy is just not very consistent. He says one thing, but there's this assessment of him that you hear from time to time, that he tends to express the ideas that he's heard in the conversation he had 10 minutes ago. That he tends to not be really very steady or, very consistent again in his positions. But overall, you have to look at what he's done, and there's just no reason to believe that he isn't an ardent supporter of Israel. Now, maybe on some level, like he has some doubts about it. I don't know. I just don't know what's going on in his mind. But the truth is, and I guess like to this extent, I'll agree with Gilbert Doctorow, that Zionism is such a powerful force in this country that it is, I think, virtually every any president, any conceivable president in the foreseeable future, just simply can't take it on directly. You just can't.
How do we know? Nobody's tried. Nobody. I just
Well,
feel it's hard for me to imagine that it's still that powerful. You know, I sometimes feel like Zionism is similar to the deep state. We never really were kind of aware of it. There was people on the fringe chattering about it. 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And then when Trump came along, we started to really see the deep state. And that's what brought down the deep state. And I kind of feel like that's what's happening now with Zionism and in Israel. A lot of people were just kind of just superficially aware of what was happening there. They don't really pay attention. It's like, oh yeah, they're throwing a lot of rocks and shooting rockets at each other. They're a little crazy. And now what's happened since October 7th, the reaction is it's just been going on so long that it's hard for people to look away, and they're starting to see like, well, what is this Zionism? And they're starting to explore and understand like, hey, I don't really support this. This isn't really America. First of all, it's not America first. This is something that Trump really campaigned on. And then we have this huge glaring exception with everything that he said he was campaigning about. A lot of the MAGA movement was built on. And I think we are seeing some people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and, people within the Republican Party are saying like, hey, why are we doing this? Why are we bombing Yemen? Why are we antagonizing Iran? This isn't in our national, security interest. This isn't in the best interest of America. It's not America first. And the more that we continue to support Israel, I think more and more the tentacles of Zionism in U.S. government is becoming apparent. People are always talking about AIPAC now. People are talking about the ADL. People are talking about, the anti-Semitism and the suppression of free speech. That was a huge part of the conservative movement and MAGA movement is talking about freedom of speech, but it's like, but you can't criticize Israel. That's starting to become an exception, and it's a real problem now, and it's a little scary. So I just feel like the longer that this goes down, more and more people are becoming disenchanted with the concept of Zionism and an Israel first foreign policy. So I think someone should try. I think the next president, someone should try that platform and see if it works. And then if they go, even if they don't win, I think the Israeli lobby guns will be pointed so openly at this person that everybody will be like, okay, yeah, we know who really runs the U.S. government now. And then it's over. It's exposed, and people will vote him out, right? That's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, no, there's quite a bit to what you say, but first, I think I have to maybe again, temper your expectations, or maybe correct a couple of things you said. The deep state has not been defeated. It's taken a blow. For example, again, that bright light that was shined on USAID, that was a real blow to the deep state. And you find out now there are investigations being conducted in countries around the world. Say, wait a second, what have these people been doing? I think there are always voices in these different countries, most recently in Kazakhstan. But it was, criticisms were made, accusations were made, but they were often disregarded, or people had trouble believing, but that these accusations were true. But now when the U.S. government itself, reveals that they're true, that really strengthens let's say, the pro-sovereignty, pro-multipolar forces around the world. So that's significant. It is a blow to deep state plans, but the deep state is still there. Just like I was telling you about the negotiation team, about the embassy restaffing. The Russians sat down and they saw the same faces on the other side. Hey, they're not gone. Remember, there are a lot of people, these government departments are huge. And yeah, they've taken some blows, but still, by and large, the State Department is the State Department. And, that's one of the centers of the deep state. And the CIA is still the CIA, and so on and so forth. So, it's not over. And then, let's see, what else should I think? Oh, well, just talking about Israel. Yeah, okay. There's no question about it that there's a skepticism and actually an opposition to Zionism that now exists that didn't exist before, but it just hasn't made its way into the corridors of power. One thing is like you point to, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Okay, yeah, she's asked real questions about her, and kudos to her for that. But she is not representing the Republican Party, unfortunately. She's actually an outlier, and I think that has to be recognized. But at least, okay, we did have outliers in the past too. Going back to the 70s, 80s, there were the occasional Republicans that really spoke up. Actually, way back then, more often in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. So, yeah, this, I think that, as we've said many times, actually, that the days of Zionism are numbered. That especially what's taken place since October 7th really has revealed Zionism's ugly face to the world. And that is having an impact all around the world, including in the U.S., but you're not seeing it reflected yet, within the corridors of power. Now, I guess what you're arguing, and I think this is reasonable, is that, well, as the reality shifts kind of under our feet, we get more and more young people in particular that are becoming highly critical of Israel, mostly on the left, but also on the right. Eventually that will be reflected in the corridors of power, but it's not yet. And it's nowhere near to it yet. When you look at the money, you look at the commanding institutions of the culture, of the media, they're all firmly Zionist. Now, and both parties are. It's bipartisan. If you have a vote on something like what's happening in Yemen, it's going to be like the number of people that are going to oppose it you probably can count them on the fingers of one hand or maybe two hands. I don't know. This is what we're looking at. This is still the truth. And yeah, it's also in the past, okay, it's not like nobody has ever taken on the Zionists, maybe not directly, but indirectly. The George Bush Sr., say one of the reasons, and some people argue the reason that he lost his election to Clinton, why he wasn't reelected back in 1992, was that he actually suspended loan guarantees to Israel, and that set off alarm bells among the various within the Israel lobby and all their supporters in the media, and they really went after him tooth and nail. And he pointed that out apparently even to his son. It's like, you don't cross them. There is this real fear, which is based on real history, of congressmen and presidents that have tried to cross the Israel lobby, even in very minor ways, but they just come down hard. And now look at Trump. Okay, yeah, Trump is, like we've said, he's maybe the kind of guy that does it. It's not. I think people make a mistake about Trump, thinking that he's crafty and he's playing 5-dimensional chess and all that. I don't think anything's true. Sometimes he's very effective and he does things that nobody else did, but it's not because it's because of his intellectual power. It's just raw kind of emotion and just brashness, fearlessness. He says the things that you're not supposed to say. And we found that, because, I think politicians in both parties say, oh, you can never say this. But they've been taught that, by the people around them and by previous politicians. And then he went out and said it, and the sky didn't fall. And that's really changed things. And again, we see it happening. That's part of what we see happening with regard to Russia. But I think he would have a reason to believe the sky would fall if he went directly after Israel. Like, he is surrounded by, Zionist extremists. He is funded by Zionist extremists. And, he can give his, I was just thinking the other day, like when he gave his address to Congress, he got all kinds of applause. But if he went directly after Israel, I don't think anybody would stand up, or maybe 2 or 3 people on the whole. It's a whole different kettle of fish here. So yeah, maybe that day is not so far off as we like to think. Maybe it's just a few years down the road, but I don't think we're there yet, where you can actually take them on directly. That's my own feeling, but sometimes we can be surprised.
Yeah, it's just hard for me to fully grasp that because part of the appeal of somebody for a lot of people, for someone like Trump or Elon Musk, is the fact that they're billionaires. They're so rich that they can't be owned by anybody, that they're their own people. But apparently that's not true. It seems like they're still owned. How for me, it's like, how can $100 million from Miriam Adelson buy that much influence with somebody that's a billionaire? You know,
No.
when you're dealing with people like Trump or Musk, but they're Zionists as well. Like, why? It's like, why? You have all the money in the world. You can be your own man. And you know, he has voiced sentiments before about like these wars in the Middle East are pointless, a huge waste of money. He posted that video of Jeffrey Sachs where he called Netanyahu a deep dark son of a bitch and trying to get us in war with Iran. Then 2 months later, he's talking about basically, hey,
War.
Iran, don't do anything. Don't fund the Houthis. Don't give them any support while we continue to funnel money and weapons into Israel so they can do whatever they want, or funnel money and weapons into Ukraine, basically all over the world. You know, just the hypocrisy of it is just laid bare. So I just, it's hard for me to see why that's the case. I feel like Trump has, you know, he has kind of a cult following. He has the ability, I think, to do things that previous presidents weren't able to do. If he really pushed against it, and he has a megaphone that, you know, that I think can't be suppressed. You know, they obviously tried to suppress him, and it didn't work. So I feel like if he wanted to, he can. But I guess it's comes down to that it's a deep-seated sentiment that he loves Israel, and he supports what they're doing.
Right.
Do you think
Yeah.
that's really what it is?
Right.
I mean,
Well, again,
how can you support that? Like, it says he's a man of peace, and he seems to be a man of peace when it comes to Russia. But how can he not be when it comes to the rest to the Middle East at all?
well, I think that Israel is often the great exception. I mean, it was something that as something that the progressives, you know, the leftists talk about. They refer to people progressive PEP, progressive except Palestine. But then you can also say that on, you know, I think especially these days on the populist right, you know, you're all about sovereignty and, like, you know, America for the Americans, France for the French. But then when it comes to Zionism, you know, that sovereignty, you know, your own interests go out the window, and you end up just subordinating your own nation's interests to Israel. Israel is a great exception to everything. You know, that's the sad truth. It's hard to find people in either party, you know, in either on the left or the right, that really can't escape that.
Well, you know, Israel's digging its own grave, what they're doing, and they're doing it with the mass slaughter of tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of civilians. You know, this most recent bombing campaign, over 400 dead and just, I don't know how many wounded, I think over 80 children. So what is Netanyahu's plan? Is it just to eradicate all of them? Does he think he can kill all of the people in Gaza? Like, what is the goal here?
I don't think he cares, you know, if whether he kills them, but he would probably prefer to just drive them out and make some sort of agreement with some third country to receive them. You know, recently, Israel reached out to 3 African countries, and I know that they got an outright refusal from South Sudan, but the others were Somaliland and Somalia, and I haven't heard anything about that, but you know, I doubt that's going anywhere. Just as an aside, you know, I was born in Uganda, and way back, you know, in the early days of Zionism, the British actually offered Uganda to the Zionists. You could say, well, maybe you can have your homeland for the Jews, you know, here in Uganda. We own this territory, but the Zionists, Theodore Herzl, rejected that. Anyway, that's just a little historical tidbit, but it shows, you know, that this Zionism, it goes way back. You know, it's well over 100 years, and it's the same thing. It's the same creature it was back then that is now. I think maybe it's take on a different form. You know, where before it was entirely secular and mostly leftist. Now it's, you know, it's mostly religious and right wing, but it's still Zionism.
Right. Well, you say it goes way back, but it depends on how you're looking at it because people want to take it as something that was sort of a, when we talk about Christian Zionism or just this biblical right, the Zionists say this is our home for over 3,000 years. Well, that's not true. We haven't
No,
had that theory that this for
right,
3,000 years of Zionism. It's only been, 130 years or something like this.
something like that. Yeah,
Right. So it is in that sense a relatively new phenomenon.
definitely. Yeah.
And I don't know how much longer it's going to last because I think as they continue this campaign against Gaza, and we talked about this before, resuming after everybody's seen all the destruction and death in Gaza, resuming it, I think is going to cost them what remaining goodwill they may have left in the world if they continue on this campaign. And I just don't. It's just all bad. I just don't see it ending well. I'm really concerned about Iran striking back. I'm hearing just the. I'm sure you saw that True Social tweet from Trump. I mean, it was really directed at Iran. All these threats towards Iran, saying, you better back down. Anything if what the Houthis are doing, we consider that's what you're doing. And I saw Colonel McGregor said that some Iranian ship was sunk in the Red Sea. I don't know if that's been verified at all.
I haven't heard that. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just I'm worried. Like this, Iran, will they retaliate? Will they push back? What the capabilities of the Houthis, I think, are also greatly underestimated by people like Trump. We like to think that this is just these people are, they're in abject poverty. That's correct, but they do have some pretty impressive technology, and we've seen that. And so they might sink a U.S. Vessel, and then, boom, where are we? And then everything that Trump's built in terms of saying that he's a man for peace, it's all out the window, and everything could go sideways. Negotiations and a settlement with Russia as well could be derailed because. Obviously Iran and Russia have a very close relationship as well. Yeah. So, I don't know, how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, well, I think, again, it has to be remembered that Netanyahu always made clear his intentions. He didn't want to go past the first phase. And I think, a lot of these things are true. It's going to further harm Israel's international standing, but it's clear that the Israeli government really doesn't care about that, the current administration. And the current administration that's headed by Netanyahu, who has been consolidating his power in recent days by firing the head of Shin Bet. He's potentially going to fire the attorney general. He earlier fired the IDF chief of staff. And it was really clearly, when you look at it, it was a matter of questions of personal loyalty. He's trying to just tighten his grip on the Israeli government and is having success. He was under investigation, or he still is technically under investigation for corruption. And actually, on the day that he launched the attack on Gaza that killed, according to the health authorities there, more than 400 people, he was supposed to appear in court and for, a hearing with regard to the corruption charges. But then he said, no, we have a national emergency. I can't. And the judge agreed. So you're looking at it. He has powerful kind of career reasons, personal political reasons for launching this attack. It's not just his matter of keeping out of jail, ending the corruption investigation, but he wants to get all the extremists back on board. He lost some of them. For example, he lost Ben-Gvir, the security minister, when he initially agreed to the ceasefire. Now, I remember back then, the rumors were that he was telling, hey, Ben, we're going to break the ceasefire. Don't worry about it. And indeed he has, and Ben-Gvir has been reappointed to his position. So he's got his coalition. He's avoiding, the corruption charges. He has, again, powerful personal incentives. Now, within Israel, Israel's a very divided society. They're not really divided. Again, it has to be emphasized, they're not divided over Zionism. But the hostage issue is huge, and that's a great point of division, that a lot of people wanted the ceasefire to go ahead, the one that had been initially agreed to. They were going to enter into the second phase, and the Israelis would start withdrawing, from Gaza, and all the hostages would be returned, and there would be a permanent ceasefire. That's what was supposed to happen. Now, again, a lot of Israelis wanted that to go ahead because they wanted to see all the hostages home. And so, the way that Netanyahu, he understands that. So the way he's framing this, it says, well, the Hamas is refusing to cooperate. They just keep on stonewalling, and we've had enough. We're going to get our hostages. We're going to have to apply direct pressure on Hamas and force them to come to the table and agree to return our hostages. Now, again, that's nonsense. There was this prior agreement that Netanyahu himself torn up, and they didn't go into the second phase they promised they would go into. And more than that, of course, there have been huge breaches on the Israeli side. We've talked about the cutoff of humanitarian aid, the cutoff of electricity. Earlier, they were supposed to supply something like 200,000 tents. They only supplied a very small fraction of that. They were supposed to supply like what they call caravans. I think they're just basically like mobile homes or trailers. And there are 60,000 of them. My understanding is they haven't supplied any. And this is very important. People are dying from exposure, and the cutoff of electricity means no drinking water, very, very little, or the drinking water that's available is just not safe. Sewage in the streets, all this is horrible, and these are all really war crimes, and these are things that Netanyahu's administration has done, but they managed to put all the blame on Hamas. Now, okay, let's just, for argument's sake, agree that Netanyahu, let's just pretend that what he says is true, okay, and that Hamas has not been forthcoming, and so he's doing this in order to pressure them. Okay, I think there's approximately 32 hostages, live hostages, that are supposed to be returned. We call them hostages. Some of them are actually prisoners of war, like IDF. We shouldn't be calling those hostages. Some are real hostages. Some of them are not. Okay, but just a total of 32 people that are supposed to be returned in the second phase. Now, to get these 32 returned, he's just killed over 400 people. Just like, in what world does this make any sort of ethical sense? It's kind of like the earlier attack where they killed over, I think it was 200 Palestinians, almost entirely civilians, to rescue 3 hostages. And it was celebrated in the U.S. It was celebrated by Trump. As Trump is celebrating this, let's be honest. I mean, we just don't. Yeah, occasionally he says things that give us a little bit of hope, but he also is. But in truth, he's supporting just these most horrible of actions. So, yeah, anyway, I think that Netanyahu clearly is quite serious about this. I mean, he always was. In fact, if anybody who wanted to listen, he made his intentions clear. And now here he is. He's got all his extremists back on board. He's safe from the corruption investigation. And he's trying to play this as like, this is for the hostages. Now, I think a lot of the people in the hostage movement in Israel are not fooled. But it's not clear that they really will be able to do anything about it. We'll see. There's kind of not quite a civil war, of course, within Israel, but it's a very polarized society over, issues like Netanyahu himself and his, what the liberals there regard as his increasingly authoritarian bent and his, destruction or suppression of various important institutions that I think that like the liberals always felt like they belong to them. And I'm actually talking about, Shin Bet, that's the equivalent of the FBI there, or the IDF. Again, that tells you who the liberals are in that country, that these were regarded as liberal institutions. But within Israeli society, Israeli politics, they are. And there's a real battle taking place over them. So, he could be brought down, and it's possible anyway that somebody could replace him that could go ahead with a ceasefire. But the thing is that you hear, like even on the liberal side, and I've been reading a lot of articles in Haaretz, is that, yeah, let's just go ahead with the ceasefire and then we'll take care of Hamas later. So in other words, like even the liberals are talking about breaking the promise that, that the ceasefire is supposed to be permanent. And so it doesn't look good either way. It looks very, very bad for Gaza.
Is the IDF going back in with troops on the ground, or was this just a bombing campaign? I mean, could this have just been a one and done type of thing? Or are we seeing a complete resumption of, what we saw for the first 13, 14 months since October 7th?
Yeah. I think they're talking about a ground offensive. I know that is in the works, or that's being planned, but to my knowledge, it hasn't occurred yet. It's entirely an air campaign. Of course, that's how these campaigns often begin. They begin in the air and then the ground troops follow. Now, that's going to be a problem again, because the IDF is, what I heard was that, like, back shortly after October 7th, there was a lot of enthusiasm within Israeli society, and people, showed up at the various, I don't know if you call them enlistment centers, they're reserves. They showed up and at these, various, we'll call them enlistment centers, but willingly and in great numbers, pretty much 100% turnout. When the call went out for reservists, they all showed up. But that has been steadily diminishing over time. And I think the most recent call up only got a 50% response. People have been, a lot of these soldiers are tired. Again, Israel is used to short wars. This has gone on for about a year and a half, and they have their own lives. A lot of them have seen and done horrible things, and and are psychologically damaged and don't want to go back. It's going to be tough for the IDF, but again, they got a lot of weapons, they got a lot of bombs, and they're starving this population. It's not really a fair fight.
It seems to be a huge problem if Netanyahu is facing these corruption charges, and what it sounds like once the ceasefire went into effect and we were having a little bit of relief for the Palestinians, then these corruption charges started to creep back into the political speech of Israel. And then the solution is, well, I guess I got to just keep on bombing the Palestine. Gaza. That seems like a huge problem. Like, that shouldn't be okay. Like, I might get in trouble, so I better kill more people, kill more Palestinians to avoid getting in trouble. That's insane. Like, well, that shouldn't be allowed, right? I mean, like, you can't just get away from. I mean, I guess we're kind of seeing a similar thing in Ukraine with Zelensky, not allowing for elections by declaring martial law. I got to keep this war going to stay in power.
Yeah.
We should fix that. We shouldn't. That shouldn't be allowed. I mean, I think that should be a clear thing. I mean, that's, I think, the most important time to have a democratic processes are in times of war, so that people can say, "Look, I don't want to die for this. This is not a cause worth fighting for." I guess we can't solve other countries' problems and write their constitutions, though. So I won't even ask you.
Well, it's a common problem. It's not a problem that's just limited to Israel or Ukraine. We've seen it in the U.S. too. I mean, that we call it, just calling an emergency in order to distract, from some kind of scandal or whatever. I think, like, just thinking back to, this is a pretty minor example, but a good one. It's Clinton. When the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke out, he launched this attack on what they. He claimed it was a chemical weapons factory in Sudan. The Sudanese said that it was just a pharmaceutical factory. But it was something that many people back then recognized as a deliberate attempt to just distract attention. Now, he didn't actually declare a state of emergency, but this sort of thing happens. It happened under Lincoln during the Civil War.
Yeah, well, it's pretty crummy, you have a personal thing. Monica Lewinsky, let's just kill a bunch of Sudanese, and then they won't look at me.
We'll have some. We'll get out of the headlines. The scandal will drop from the headlines, and we'll be talking about other things. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, last question is how concerned are you about a potential war with Iran now? Do you think this is really on the table, that we're really pushing that this is really starting to heat up?
Well, it's quite scary. You pointed to Trump's rhetoric and, against the statement that any action taken by the Houthis we can attribute to Iran, and Iran will pay the consequences. That's a direct threat to, bring the war to Iran. And the Houthis have shown themselves to be very independent and, not, and it basically impossible to, recalcitrant. I mean, these people are not going to be scared, into withholding their fire. And I think that we will see attacks on commercial shipping again. And then we'll see what Trump will do. Now, of course, Trump has made threats in the past that he has not made good on. So maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe there are enough sensible people around him. I understand Vance doesn't want to have war with Iran. I understand that Rubio doesn't, but Waltz, I think, does. Maybe there are enough sensible people. We've seen that in the past. We've come very close to war with Iran under other presidents, and then we've always kind of pulled back because I think there's enough realistic people, like in the places like the Pentagon, where say that, hey, this is going to be really bad for us, Mr. President. So let's not do this. So it's scary. I think we have every reason to be very worried about it, but there's at least an even chance that that the U.S. won't go that far.
Okay, fingers crossed. Yeah, it'll end terribly. I just don't think that that's such a poor calculation on the behalf of the U.S. if we do decide to engage in a war with Iran. And think about all of our bases out there in the Middle East, all of our aircraft carriers. Iran does possess the ability to wipe our bases out in the Middle East and to sink a large part of our Navy. Surely the Pentagon is aware of that. Surely they won't make this such a stupid decision. But sometimes you wonder who's calling the shots. This is something that Netanyahu this has been his dream for 30 years, right? Is to take down Iran. So, and it seems like that's his sole mission. And he is, he's an evil man, but he is a wily man, and he's a dangerous person, and he knows how to pull strings and get what he wants. So I hate it the way you say make it sound it's like a coin toss, and I hate that that's what it might be. Okay, well, let's pray for cooler heads to prevail, and we can get peace in the Middle East under a Trump presidency. But what he's done the past week has been very disappointing for me with regards to the Middle East. So I'm not quite as hopeful. But okay, any parting words, Dad?
No, I think.
Okay, good. All right, have a good rest of your day. Okay, bye.